Sometimes, the loneliest soul finds salvation in an unexpected place. For Boone Laramie, salvation came drowning in a Montana river, a small mountain lion cub, helpless and frightened. Living alone in the wilderness, Boone had spent years nursing wounds deeper than flesh. When he pulled the cub from rushing waters, he expected the mother's fury. Instead, she did something that defied nature. She left her baby with him. As days turned to weeks, the cub became the family Boone had lost to tragedy. But when the mother lion finally returned, she didn't come for revenge. What she revealed would unlock a mystery that haunted Boone for a lifetime. Could a wild creature truly understand a broken heart? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Montana Territory stretched wide and unforgiving under a sky that seemed to hold more blue than any man deserved to witness in a single lifetime. Boone Laramie had lived beneath that sky for 43 years, the last 7 of them in a solitude so complete that some days he forgot the sound of his own voice. His cabin sat tucked against the eastern slope of what the locals called Redemption Ridge, where the Clearwater River made a long, sweeping bend before tumbling down through a series of rapids that had claimed more than one foolish traveler over the years. The cabin itself was modest. Rough-hewn logs chinked with mud and moss, a stone chimney that drew smoke clean on all but the windiest days, and a single window facing west, so Boone could watch the sun die each evening. He had built it with his own hands in the autumn of 1876, working dawn to dusk with an urgency that had nothing to do with the coming winter, and everything to do with the need to exhaust himself so thoroughly that sleep would come without dreams. It hadn't worked. The dreams came anyway. On his small wooden table, worn smooth by years of use, sat a leather-bound journal, the only artifact of his former life that Boone allowed himself to keep close. The journal had belonged to his wife, Sarah, and contained her careful drawings of wildflowers and birds, each one labeled in her neat schoolteacher's hand. He never opened it. Just knowing it was there seemed enough, a tangible reminder that he had once been a different man, capable of love and laughter and all those bright, fragile things that seemed as distant now as the stars. The nearest settlement was Timber Falls, a rough collection of buildings 15 miles south, where miners and trappers traded their goods and drowned their sorrows in rot-gut whiskey. Boone made the trip once a month, trading furs and the gold he occasionally panned from the river for flour, coffee, salt, and ammunition. He spoke to no one beyond the bare necessities of commerce. The townsfolk had learned to leave him be. There was only one exception to his isolation, a rancher named Caleb Morrison, who lived 10 miles downriver with his wife Ruth and their 2 grown sons. Caleb was a hard man in the way that the land demanded, but fair, and he had known Boone before the fire, before the loss, before the silence. Once every few months, Caleb would ride up to check on him, bringing news from town and a jar of Ruth's preserves. He never stayed long. Both men understood that some wounds ran too deep for company to heal. Boone's days followed a rhythm as unchanging as the seasons. He rose with first light, tended to his horse, a steady grey gelding named Ash, and checked his trap lines that stretched along the river and up into the pine forests. He was skilled at reading the wilderness, understanding its language of broken twigs and disturbed earth, knowing where the deer would bed down and where the elk would cross come autumn. The land provided if a man knew how to listen. In the afternoons he worked. There was always work, splitting wood, mending fences, tanning hides, repairing tack. His hands stayed busy, while his mind wandered paths he tried not to follow. When the light began to fail, he would sit on the porch he'd built facing the river and smoke his pipe, watching the water move in its eternal hurry towards some place it would never quite reach. The river was his companion and his confessor. In its constant voice, he found a kind of peace, or at least a numbing that passed for peace. Sometimes he spoke to it, telling it things he would never tell another living soul. The river kept his secrets without judgment. carrying them away downstream to be forgotten in the vastness of its journey. It was late spring now, and the snowmelt had swollen the Clearwater to twice its normal width. The rapids roared day and night, a sound so constant that silence would have seemed strange. The mountain wildflowers were beginning to show, Indian paintbrush and lupine splashing color across the meadows, and the aspens were leafing out in that fresh, impossible green that only comes once a year. Sarah had loved this time of year. She used to walk for hours gathering specimens for her journal, returning with her apron full of petals and stems, her face flushed with happiness. Boone pushed the memory away. Some doors were better left closed. He was checking his northernmost trapline on a Thursday morning when he first heard the sound, a high, keening cry that didn't belong to any creature he knew. The sound was coming from the direction of the river, from a spot where the current cut close against a rocky outcrop before sweeping wide around a gravel bar. Boone moved toward it carefully, his rifle loose in his hands, his senses alert. What he saw stopped him in his tracks. A mountain lion cub, no more than 8 or 10 weeks old by the look of it, was struggling in the shallows near the bank. The current had it, pulling it inexorably toward the rapids downstream. Its small paws scrabbled uselessly against the smooth river stones, and its cries grew weaker as exhaustion took hold. Boone's first instinct was to back away. Where there was a cub, there was a mother, and a she-lion protecting her young was as dangerous as anything that walked these mountains. But the cub was drowning. Boone had perhaps 30 seconds to make his decision. He could see the exact moment when the cub's strength would fail, when the current would claim it and dash it against the rocks below. His mind calculated the risk. A mother lion nearby, probably watching, certainly ready to attack any threat to her offspring. The smart choice was to walk away, let nature take its course. He had survived 7 years in this wilderness by respecting its rules and keeping his distance from its dangers. The cub's head went under. Boone didn't remember making the decision. His body simply moved, driven by some instinct older than thought. He dropped his rifle and waded into the shallows, the icy water shocking his legs, even through his wool pants. 3 long strides brought him within reach. He grabbed the cub by the scruff of its neck, the way he'd seen barn cats carry their kittens, lifting it clear of the water just as the current tried to sweep them both downstream. The little creature was surprisingly heavy, its fur plastered against a body that was all bone and sinew. It didn't fight him. Whether from exhaustion or some animal understanding that he meant no harm, it hung limp in his grip, its yellow eyes wide and terrified. Boone stumbled back toward the bank, his boots slipping on the river stones, his heart hammering in his chest. He made it to dry ground and set the cub down gently in the grass. It lay there panting, water streaming from its coat, shivering in the morning air. Boone stood over it, catching his own breath, waiting for the attack he was certain would come. That was when he saw her. The mother lion stood at the edge of the tree line, perhaps 40 yards distant. She was magnificent, easily 7 feet from nose to tail, her tawny coat rippled with muscle, her amber eyes fixed on Boone with an intensity that made his mouth go dry. Every instinct screamed at him to reach for his rifle, but he forced himself to remain still. Sudden movement would trigger the attack. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other, man and beast, separated by 40 yards and an unbridgeable gulf of nature. Boone could see the tension in her body, the way her shoulders bunched, as if preparing to spring. He thought of Sarah, of the children they'd never had time to raise, of all the years he'd spent courting death in these mountains without ever quite finding it. It seemed fitting, somehow, that it would come like this. But the mountain lion didn't attack. Instead, she did something that Boone would replay in his mind 1,000 times in the days to come. She took 3 slow steps forward, her eyes never leaving his face. Then she circled, not the tight hunting circle of a predator about to strike, but a wide, deliberate arc that brought her downwind of him and the cub. She stopped, lifted her head to scent the air, and then did something even stranger. She turned and walked away. Not hurried, not fearful, but with the calm dignity of a creature making a choice. She disappeared into the pines without looking back, leaving her cub lying in the grass at Boone's feet, still shivering, still terrified, still very much alive. Boone stood frozen, unable to process what had just happened. In all his years in the wilderness, in all the accumulated knowledge he'd gathered about animal behavior, nothing had prepared him for this. A mother mountain lion abandoning her cub. It defied every natural law he understood. He looked down at the small creature. It had raised its head and was watching him with those unsettling yellow eyes, so different from the soft brown eyes of domestic animals. There was something ancient in that gaze, something that spoke of bloodlines stretching back to the days when saber-toothed cats ruled these mountains. The cub mewed, a small, pitiful sound that twisted something in Boone's chest. He knew he should leave it. The mother would return. This was some temporary aberration, some confusion caused by the rescue. Natural order would reassert itself. But even as he thought these things, Boone found himself shrugging out of his coat. The morning air was still cold despite the advancing spring, and the cub was shivering so hard he could see it from where he stood. He wrapped the little creature in his coat, gathering it up with a gentleness that surprised him. It didn't resist, just pressed against the warmth of the fabric, its shivers gradually subsiding. Boone stood there holding it, looking toward the tree line where the mother had vanished, waiting for her to return and reclaim what was hers. She didn't come. The sun climbed higher. Birds called from the pines. The river rushed on toward its distant destination, and still the mother lion didn't return. Finally, as the morning edged toward noon, Boone made a decision that would change everything. He carried the cub back to his cabin, his rifle awkward in one hand, the small bundle warm against his chest. With each step, he expected to hear the scream of an enraged mother lion, to feel the impact of 150 pounds of fury hitting him from behind. But the attack never came. When he reached his cabin, Boone paused on the porch, looking back the way he'd come. The wilderness stretched out before him, vast and unknowable, holding its secrets close. Somewhere out there, a mother lion had made a choice that went against every instinct nature had given her. Somewhere out there she was watching, waiting, judging. Boone pushed open his cabin door and stepped inside, carrying another living creature across his threshold for the first time in 7 years. The journal on his table seemed to catch the light from the window, Sarah's careful handwriting visible through the worn leather cover. He set the cub down near the fireplace and began building a fire to drive away the chill. He didn't know it yet, but his long isolation was over. The river had given him a gift and a burden, and in accepting both, he had taken the first step on, a path that would lead him back to the land of the living, and eventually to a truth that had been waiting for him all along in the depths of the wilderness he called home. The first night was the hardest. Boone had no experience with infant animals beyond the occasional orphan barn kitten, and a mountain lion cub was a far cry from anything domestic. The little creature, he found himself thinking of it as she, though he had no way of knowing for certain, refused the milk he tried to offer in a shallow dish. She mewed pitifully, turning her head away from everything he presented, her small body growing weaker as the hours passed. By midnight, Boone was certain she would be dead by morning. He sat on the floor beside the fire, watching her labored breathing, feeling a familiar helplessness creep over him. It was the same feeling he'd had 7 years ago, watching flames consume the only things that mattered while he stood useless and broken in the night. Some things couldn't be saved, no matter how desperately you wanted to save them. Some losses were inevitable. But somewhere around 3 in the morning, as the fire burned down to coals and the cabin settled into the deep silence that comes before dawn, the cub stirred. She crawled, weak, stumbling, to where Boone sat with his back against the wall. And then she did something that broke through the ice he'd built around his heart. She climbed into his lap, curled against his chest, and began to purr. It wasn't the rumbling purr of a house cat. It was something lighter, more tentative, a vibration. That seemed to say she trusted him, despite every reason not to. Boone sat perfectly still, afraid to breathe, afraid to shatter this fragile moment. The cub's warmth seeped through his shirt, and he found his hand, without conscious thought, gently stroking her damp fur. She fell asleep like that, nestled against him, and Boone realized with a start that his cheeks were wet. He hadn't cried since the fire, not once in 7 years. He'd thought himself beyond tears, carved into something harder and less human by grief and isolation. But here in the darkness, with this wild thing sleeping trustingly in his arms, something in him cracked open. Dawn found them in the same position. Boone's back ached, and his legs had gone numb, but he hadn't moved. When the cub finally stirred and looked up at him with those unsettling yellow eyes, he felt something shift in his chest. A loosening of a knot he'd carried so long he'd forgotten it was there. "All right then," he said softly, his voice rusty from disuse. "Let's see about getting you some breakfast." The solution came from an unexpected source. Boone remembered that Caleb's sons raised goats, and where there were goats, there was milk fresher and richer than anything that came from a cow. It was a 10-mile ride to the Morrison Ranch, and every instinct told Boone not to leave the cub alone. But she needed food, proper food, if she was going to survive. He fashioned a bed from an old blanket near the fireplace, made sure the fire was banked but warm, and filled a shallow pan with water. The cub watched him with keen interest as he moved about the cabin, already showing the alertness that would serve her well if she survived to adulthood. Before he left, Boone knelt beside her and ran his hand along her spine. "I'll be back," he told her, feeling foolish for talking to an animal that couldn't understand him. "You stay put here." The ride to Morrison's ranch took him through country he knew as well as his own reflection. Pine forests giving way to open meadows, the land rolling gently upward toward the higher peaks that still held snow, even in late spring. He pushed Ash harder than usual, uneasy about leaving the cub alone for so long. Caleb Morrison was in his barn when Boone rode up, a big man with iron-gray hair and hands, scarred by a lifetime of honest work. He looked up from the harness he was mending, surprise clear on his weathered face. "Boone Laramie," he said, setting down his tools. "Wasn't expecting to see you for another few weeks." Boone dismounted, suddenly unsure how to explain what he needed without sounding like a man who'd spent too much time alone. "Need some goat's milk," he said finally. "Fresh if you've got it, I can pay." Caleb studied him with eyes that missed very little. "Goat's milk," he repeated. "You take up cooking, Boone? Got a cub needs feeding." "What kind of cub?" Boone hesitated, then decided the truth was simpler than any lie he might construct. "Mountain lion. Pulled her out of the Clearwater yesterday. Mother left her." Caleb's eyebrows rose. "Mother mountain lion left her cub with a man who just pulled it from the river?" "That's about the size of it." For a long moment, Caleb said nothing. Then he shook his head slowly, the way a man does when confronted with something that doesn't fit his understanding of how the world works. "That's the damnedest thing I've heard in 20 years of ranching this territory. Won't argue with you there. You sure the mother's not just waiting for you to let your guard down? Lion with cubs is about the most dangerous thing walking these mountains." "I'm sure of nothing," Boone admitted. "But the cub's going to die if she doesn't eat, and I can't seem to make myself leave her to it." Something in his voice must have conveyed the truth of it, because Caleb's expression softened. He'd been there the day after the fire, had helped Boone bury what was left. He understood better than most what drove a man to save something, anything from death's grasp. "Come on then," he said. "Let's get you that milk." Ruth Morrison took the news with more equanimity than her husband, though her eyes widened when Boone explained what he needed. She was a practical woman who'd raised 4 sons in country that didn't forgive mistakes, and she set about preparing what Boone would need with quiet efficiency. "You'll want to warm it," she instructed, filling several bottles that had once been used for feeding orphaned lambs. "Not too hot. Test it on your wrist the way you would for a baby, and don't let her drink too fast or she'll make herself sick. Little bits at first, every few hours." She paused, looking at Boone with an expression he couldn't quite read. "You know this is a wild animal, Boone. Not a pet, not a replacement for— "I know what she is," Boone said quietly. Ruth nodded, satisfied. "She'll imprint on you if you're not careful. Might never be able to go back to the wild. I'll worry about that when she's strong enough to go anywhere." The ride back seemed to take twice as long, though Boone knew it was just his anxiety making time stretch. The sun was high overhead when he finally spotted his cabin, and his heart was pounding as he dismounted and pushed through the door. The cub was exactly where he'd left her, curled in her blanket nest, but she raised her head at the sound of his entrance. She mewed, loud and insistent, and Boone felt relief flood through him so strongly his knees went weak. All right," he said, moving to warm the milk over the fire. "I'm here. I've got what you need." Getting the cub to take the bottle required patience and persistence, but once she understood what was being offered, she latched on with an urgency that spoke to her hunger. Boone held her carefully, supporting her weight, watching as she nursed with small, desperate sounds. When she'd had her fill, she fell asleep in his arms again, milk-drunk and warm. Boone carried her back to her nest and covered her gently with the blanket. Then he stood at his window, looking out toward the tree line where the mother lion had disappeared. "I'll take care of her," he said to the empty wilderness. "Don't know why you left her with me, but I'll do right by her. You have my word on that." The wilderness offered no answer, but somewhere in the distance a raven called, and the wind moved through the pines with a sound like breathing. Boone turned back to the sleeping cub and began making plans for the days ahead. He didn't know it yet, but he just stepped across a threshold. The man who'd pulled a drowning cub from the river was not the same man who now stood guard over her sleep. 7 years of careful isolation had been shattered in a single morning, and though the walls would try to rebuild themselves, they would never quite fit the same way again. That night, as the cub slept by the fire and Boone sat at his table with a cup of coffee gone cold, his eyes fell on Sarah's journal. For the first time in 7 years, he reached for it. His hands trembled as he opened the cover, but he forced himself to look at her careful drawings, her neat annotations, the evidence of her joy in the small beauties of the world. On the last page, she'd completed a sketch of a columbine in full bloom. She'd written a note. Boone had read it once, the day after her funeral, and never looked at it again. Now he read it with new eyes. There is always something worth saving, even in the darkest seasons. Beauty persists, hope remains. He closed the journal carefully and looked at the sleeping cub. Her small sides rose and fell with each breath, her paws twitching in some dream of running. She was wild and dangerous and completely dependent on him, and somehow, impossibly, she had given him a reason to wake up tomorrow that had nothing to do with mere habit. "Hope remains," Boone whispered to the empty cabin, and for the first time in 7 years, he almost believed it might be true. The cub grew stronger with each passing day. Boone named her Scout, a simple name that seemed to fit her curious nature. By the end of the first week, she was exploring the cabin with increasing boldness, her yellow eyes taking in everything with an intensity that reminded him she was a predator, no matter how small and helpless she seemed now. She stalked dust. Motes in the shafts of sunlight that came through the window pounced on his bootlaces when he wasn't looking, and had claimed Sarah's old rocking chair as her preferred sleeping spot when she wasn't curled against Boone's chest. The rocking chair had been a wedding gift from Sarah's father, crafted from oak with a high back and smooth runners that made barely a whisper on the wooden floor. Boone hadn't sat in it since she died, couldn't bear to feel the way it moved beneath him, the same way it had moved beneath her when she read by lamplight or worked on her drawings. But Scout had no such reservations. She would climb into it each afternoon when the sun struck it just right, curl into a tight ball, and sleep so deeply that Boone could carry her to her bed by the fire without waking her, watching her sleep. In Sarah's chair did something to Boone that he couldn't quite name. It wasn't pain, not exactly, though there was an ache to it. It was more like the feeling of a frozen limb coming back to life, uncomfortable but necessary, proof that something he'd thought dead was merely dormant. The feeding routine became the framework around which his days were built. Every 4 hours, like clockwork, he would warm the goat's milk and hold Scout while she nursed. She was growing rapidly now, putting on weight, her coat taking on a sleeker, healthier sheen. Her baby spots were clearly visible, the rosettes. That would fade as she matured, but for now made her look almost domestic in the right light. Ruth Morrison sent fresh milk every few days via her youngest son, Thomas, a quiet young man of 20 who seemed fascinated by the idea of Boone raising a mountain lion. Thomas would linger longer than necessary, watching Scout play, asking questions about her behavior and growth. Boone found himself talking more than he had in years, explaining things he'd observed, sharing small details about Scout's personality. "She's smart," Thomas observed one afternoon, watching Scout successfully navigate the latch on the box where Boone kept dried meat. "Smarter than any dog I've seen. Smarter than most people I've known," Boone agreed, gently removing Scout from the box and securing the latch more carefully. She complained with a sound somewhere between a chirp and a growl, then promptly forgot her indignation when she spotted a moth near the ceiling. Thomas grinned. "Ma wants to know if you'll bring her down to the ranch sometime. Says she'd like to see this miracle for herself." Boone considered it. The idea of leaving his cabin for a social visit felt strange, wrong somehow, like wearing clothes that no longer fit. But he owed the Morrisons more than he could ever repay, and refusing would be churlish. "Maybe next week," he said, "when she's a bit bigger." After Thomas left, Boone sat on his porch and watched Scout explore the area immediately around the cabin. She stayed close, never venturing more than 20 yards from the door, always keeping him in sight. It reminded him of the way children played, bold but cautious, testing boundaries while remaining tethered to safety. The thought of children brought Sarah back to him as sharp and clear as if she were standing beside him. They'd planned for 3, she'd said, 2 boys and a girl, or maybe 2 girls and a boy, she didn't mind which. They would raise them out here in this beautiful wilderness, teach them to read the weather and respect the land, give them a childhood full of clear streams and mountain air and freedom. The fire had taken all of that. The fire and Boone's own carelessness. He'd been clearing brush too close to the house on a windy October day. A single ember had been enough. By the time he realized what was happening, the flames had already claimed the small house they'd built together in Timber Falls. Sarah had been inside, taking a nap after working in her garden all morning. She'd been 3 months pregnant with their first child. Boone had tried to reach her. The burns on his hands and arms were testament to how hard he'd tried. But the smoke had been too thick, the heat too intense. By the time men from town arrived with buckets, there was nothing left to save. He'd built this cabin in the wilderness afterward because he couldn't bear to be around people who looked at him with pity or understanding or anything other than contempt. Out here, alone, he could punish himself properly with isolation and silence. Out here, no one would try to tell him it wasn't his fault, that accidents happened, that time would heal. Scout chirped at him from where she'd discovered a beetle crawling through the grass. She pawed at it experimentally, then jumped back when it spread its wings. Her tail, still small and not quite in proportion to her body, twitched with excitement. "Leave it be," Boone called softly. "That beetle's got as much right to live as you do." Scout looked at him, seemed to consider this, then went back to stalking the insect with slightly less aggression. She was learning the sound of his voice, the cadence of his instructions. Already she would come when he called her name. Though, whether from genuine obedience or simple desire to be near him, he couldn't say. As the sun began its descent toward the mountains, Boone prepared their evening routine. He warmed milk for Scout, then set about making his own simple dinner. Salt pork and beans, bread he'd baked that morning. Scout ate her fill, and immediately began grooming herself, her rough tongue working methodically through her fur. Watching her, Boone realized he'd been smiling. When had he last smiled without bitterness behind it? That night, after Scout had claimed Sarah's rocking chair and fallen asleep with her paws tucked under her chin, Boone pulled out the journal again. He turned past Sarah's drawings to the blank pages at the back, pages she'd never filled. For a long moment, he simply looked at the empty space, thinking about legacy and loss and the strange ways that life continued, even when you were certain it had ended. Then he picked up a pencil and began to write. Day 8 with Scout. She's learning fast. Today she figured out the meat box. Ruth Morrison says she's imprinting on me, and I suppose that's true. Don't know what that means for her future, but for now she seems content. Strange to have another heartbeat in this cabin after so long. Strange, but not unwelcome. He paused, the pencil hovering over the page, then added, Sarah would have loved her. It was the first time he'd written her name since she died. The letters seemed to glow on the page in the lamplight, solid and real, and somehow less painful than he'd expected. Boone closed the journal and looked over at Scout, sleeping peacefully in the chair that had once held the woman he loved. I'm trying, he said quietly to the empty air, to Sarah's memory, to whatever force had sent this wild creature into his life. Don't know what I'm trying for exactly, but I'm trying. Outside, the night settled over the wilderness. Somewhere in the darkness, Scout's mother might be watching, waiting, judging whether the man who'd saved her cub was worthy of the trust she'd placed in him. Boone had no way of knowing, but he'd made a promise, and promises were one of the few things that still meant something to him. He would keep Scout safe, help her grow strong, and when the time came, if the time came, he would let her go back to the wild where she belonged. It would break something in him, he knew that already. But some things were worth breaking for. 3 weeks after pulling Scout from the river, Boone made good on his promise to visit the Morrison ranch. The journey took most of the morning, with Scout riding in a leather satchel Boone had fashioned for the purpose. She poked her head out intermittently, ears swiveling to catch every sound, her yellow eyes wide with interest at this new experience. When they passed through a grove of aspens, she chirped excitedly at the way the leaves shimmered in the breeze, and Boone found himself explaining things to her as if she could understand. Those are aspens, he told her. They all grow from the same root system. Means the whole grove is really just one tree, in a manner of speaking. Sarah taught me that, Scout blinked at him, then went back to watching the world pass by. The Morrison ranch sat in a wide valley where Willow Creek met the Clearwater. Good grazing land, protected from the worst of the winter winds by a horseshoe ridge to the north. Caleb had built well, a solid 2-story house, a barn that could shelter 30 head of cattle, corrals and outbuildings arranged with the practical efficiency of a man who understood his trade. Ruth came out onto the porch when she heard Ash's hooves on the packed earth of the yard. She was wiping her hands on her apron, and her face broke into a genuine smile when she saw Boone. Boone Laramie, she called. Been too long since you visited us proper. Ruth. Boone dismounted and carefully lifted the satchel. Brought someone to meet you. When he opened the bag and Scout emerged, Ruth's expression transformed into something close to wonder. Oh my, she breathed, moving closer slowly, her hands extended but not touching. Oh, Boone, she's beautiful. Scout studied Ruth with keen interest, nostrils flaring as she took in this new person's scent. Then, to Boone's surprise, she chirped, a friendly sound, and allowed Ruth to stroke her head. She's got good instincts about people, Ruth said softly, running her fingers through Scout's fur. That's a gift, especially for a wild thing. Caleb appeared from the barn, with Thomas and his older brother Samuel, both men stopping short when they saw the mountain lion cub. Samuel, a practical man like his father, shook his head in disbelief. I heard tell of it, he said, but seeing something else entirely. She really just sleeps in your cabin like a house cat? In my wife's rocking chair mostly, Boone said, and was surprised to find he could say it without the usual constriction in his chest. The afternoon passed in a way Boone hadn't experienced in years. Ruth insisted he stay for dinner, and they ate at the long table in the Morrison kitchen, roasted chicken, potatoes, fresh bread and greens from Ruth's garden. Scout sat at Boone's feet, occasionally accepting small pieces of chicken that he slipped to her, her presence accepted by the family with the same easy grace they showed to their own animals. After the meal, Caleb produced a bottle of whiskey, good Kentucky bourbon, that he'd been saving for special occasions. They sat on the porch while the sun descended toward the mountains, and for the first time in 7 years, Boone found himself talking about Sarah without the conversation ending in painful silence. "She would have gotten a kick out of this," he said, watching Scout chase fireflies in the yard as twilight gathered. "Woman who could draw every flower in these mountains to perfection, and she never got to see a mountain lion up close. Now I've got one sleeping on her furniture." Ruth laughed softly. "She had a good sense of humor, your Sarah. I remember her laughing about the time that moose got into her garden and ate all her tomatoes. Spent 2 weeks building a fence after that," Boone recalled. "She supervised every post, made sure it was tall enough that no moose would dare try again." "Did it work?" Thomas asked. "For the moose, yes. Didn't account for the deer, though. They just jumped right over." They all laughed, and the sound felt good in Boone's chest, natural, unforced, like something he'd forgotten he knew how to do. As darkness settled and the stars began to show themselves, Caleb broached a subject Boone had been expecting. "You given any thought to what you'll do when she gets bigger? A full-grown mountain lion isn't something you can keep in a cabin." "I know it," Boone admitted. "Ruth told me she might not be able to go back to the wild if she stays with me too long." "Might not," Ruth said gently. "But that doesn't mean the choice has to be made today. She's still young. There's time yet to see how things unfold." Samuel leaned forward, his expression serious. "You seen any sign of the mother?" Boone shook his head. "Nothing. It's like she vanished complete. I keep expecting her to show up, but 3 weeks now and not a trace. Strange business," Caleb mused. "A she-lion abandoning her cub goes against everything natural, unless she had a reason," Ruth said quietly. "Animals know things sometimes, things we can't understand." They sat in contemplative silence for a moment, watching Scout finally tire of chasing fireflies and trot back to the porch. She climbed into Boone's lap without hesitation, circled twice and settled in to sleep. Her purring was loud enough that everyone could hear it. "She loves you," Ruth observed. "That's clear as day." Boone ran his hand along Scout's spine, feeling the delicate bones beneath her fur, the steady rise and fall of her breathing. "Funny how things work out sometimes. Spent 7 years trying not to feel anything, and a drowned cub undoes it all in 3 weeks. That's the way of the heart," Ruth said. "It heals in its own time, in its own way. You can't rush it, but you can't stop it either. Once it's decided to mend." The ride back to his cabin that night was peaceful, with Scout dozing in her satchel and the stars providing enough light to see the familiar trail. Boone felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Contentment, maybe, or at least the beginning of it. The Morrisons had welcomed him and Scout without judgment, had treated them both with kindness and understanding. When he reached his cabin and settled Scout in Sarah's rocking chair, Boone stood at the window looking out at the darkness. His hand drifted to his pocket, where he tucked something Ruth had pressed into his palm before they left. A small cloth bag with lavender seeds. "For Sarah's garden," Ruth had whispered. "If you ever feel ready to plant again." Boone held the bag carefully, feeling the weight of the tiny seeds. He'd burned Sarah's garden plot along with everything else. Couldn't bear to see the plants she'd tended growing without her there to appreciate them. But now, standing in the quiet of his cabin, with Scout sleeping peacefully and the scent of lavender faint in his hands, he wondered if maybe Ruth was right. Maybe the heart healed in its own time. Maybe some things were worth planting again, even if you'd lost them before. He set the seed bag on the shelf next to Sarah's journal, within easy reach but not yet opened. Someday, perhaps, when he was ready. Until then, it would wait, patient as the seeds themselves, holding the promise of something beautiful yet to come. That night, he wrote in the journal again, "Visited the Morrisons today. Scout charmed them all. Ruth gave me lavender seeds. Haven't decided if I'll plant them, but I didn't throw them away either. Small steps, maybe. Sarah always said small steps were how you covered great distances." He looked over at Scout, whose ear twitched in her sleep, as if she'd heard something in her dreams. Boone smiled, set the journal aside, and prepared for bed. Tomorrow, he would check his trap lines and teach Scout how to hunt grasshoppers in the meadow. Tomorrow he would continue this strange new life that had been given to him by a drowning cub and a mother lion's mysterious choice. Tomorrow would come, and he would meet it. That was enough for now. Summer arrived in full force, transforming the wilderness into a tapestry of green and gold. Scout grew with astonishing speed. By her 8th week with Boone, she doubled in size, her legs growing longer and stronger, her paws seeming too large for her body, a promise of the size she'd eventually reach. She still slept in Sarah's rocking chair most afternoons, but increasingly she preferred to spend her time outdoors, exploring the meadows and forests around the cabin with Boone as her constant companion. He'd fashioned a collar for her from soft leather, more for his peace of mind than any practical purpose. Scout tolerated it with the patient resignation of a creature humoring someone she loved, though she made her opinion clear by attempting to remove it whenever possible. Attached to the collar was a small brass bell, another of Boone's modifications to life with a mountain lion that let him track her movements when she wandered beyond his sight. The bell had been his father's, carried across the plains in a wagon 30 years ago when his family had first come west. His father had used it to call the family to dinner, ringing it from the porch of their homestead in the evenings. When his parents died, his mother to fever, his father to a riding accident, Boone had kept the bell as one of the few things connecting him to his childhood. Now it jingled softly as Scout bounded through the tall grass, a sound that had become as familiar as the river's voice. Teaching Scout to hunt was both easier and harder than Boone had expected. The instinct was there. She stalked everything that moved, from grasshoppers to ground squirrels, but the execution required practice. He would watch her creep through the grass, her belly low, her haunches gathered beneath her, every muscle coiled with intent. Then she would pounce, launching herself through the air with more enthusiasm than accuracy, usually landing several feet from her intended target. She never seemed discouraged by failure. Each miss was simply an opportunity to try again, and with each attempt her aim improved. One morning, Boone watched her successfully catch a field mouse, her first real kill. She'd been so surprised by her success that she dropped the mouse immediately, staring at it with what looked like genuine astonishment. The mouse, equally surprised to still be alive, had scrambled away into the grass. Scout had looked at Boone as if to ask, "Did you see that? Did I really do that?" "Good work," Boone told her, unable to keep the pride from his voice. "Next time, don't let it go." By mid-July, Scout was catching her own meals regularly, mice, voles, the occasional rabbit. Boone still supplemented with goat's milk and meat from his hunting, but he could see her growing independence. She was becoming what nature had designed her to be, a predator, efficient and beautiful, and deadly in her own small way. It should have pleased him. Instead, he found himself lying awake at night, listening to her breathe in the darkness, wondering how much longer he had before she outgrew him entirely. The question of Scout's future hung over everything like a cloud that never quite broke into rain. Boone had known from the first moment he'd pulled her from the river that this was temporary. Wild things belonged to the wild. Keeping her would be selfish, would deny her the life she was meant to live. But knowing something and accepting it were two different things entirely. He'd started a new ritual. Each evening, after their dinner, and before the light failed completely, he would take Scout to the edge of the tree line and simply sit with her. He never forced her to go into the forest. He just wanted her to know it was there, wanted her to understand that the wilderness was her birthright, not a place to fear. Scout would sit beside him, her yellow eyes watching the shadows deepen beneath the pines, her ears swiveling to catch the sounds of creatures moving in the underbrush. Sometimes she would venture a few steps into the trees, investigating scents that only she could detect. But she always came back to Boone, pressing against his leg as if to reassure herself that he was still there. One evening in late July, as they sat at the tree line watching the sun paint the sky in shades of orange and rose, Boone saw something that made his breath catch. Deep in the forest, barely visible in the gathering darkness, a shape moved. It was too far away to make out clearly, But Boone's instincts told him what it was, even before his mind fully registered the information. The mother lion. She stood perhaps 50 yards into the trees, a shadow among shadows, watching them. Boone remained perfectly still, not wanting to startle Scout or provoke an attack. Scout, however, seemed unconcerned. She'd noticed the presence too. Her ears had swiveled forward. Her body had tensed slightly, but she showed no fear and made no move to approach. For a long moment, the three of them formed a strange tableau. Man, cub, and mother lion, connected by invisible threads of fate and circumstance. Then the mother lion turned and melted back into the forest as silently as she'd appeared. Boone released a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. Scout looked up at him and chirped, a sound he'd come to recognize as her way of asking questions. "That was your mama," he told her quietly. "She's been watching over you this whole time." Scout tilted her head, considering this, then went back to grooming her paws, as if the appearance of her mother was of no particular consequence. But it was of consequence to Boone. It meant the mother lion hadn't abandoned Scout in the way he'd thought. She'd been watching, waiting, allowing this strange interlude to play out while keeping her distance. The realization made Boone's throat tight. The mother lion had trusted him with her cub, had judged him worthy despite every reason not to. The weight of that trust settled on his shoulders like a physical thing. That night, Boone couldn't sleep. He sat at his table with the journal open before him, trying to find words for what he was feeling. Finally, he wrote, "Saw Scout's mother today. She's been watching all along. Don't know what she's waiting for, but I can feel something coming, like the air before a storm. Scout's growing so fast. Every day she's a little bigger, a little wilder, a little further from the helpless thing I pulled from the river. I should be glad. This is what's supposed to happen. So why does it feel like losing Sarah all over again?" He set the pencil down and looked at where Scout slept in the rocking chair. Her body stretched out now, too big to curl into a tight ball the way she used to. The brass bell on her collar caught the lamplight, gleaming softly. His father's bell, on a mountain lion's collar, in the cabin he'd built to be alone. Sarah's rocking chair, occupied by a wild creature who'd somehow found a way past all his defenses. A leather journal filled with drawings of wildflowers and his own rough attempts to document this strange summer. Nothing was the way he'd planned. 7 years ago he'd come to this wilderness to die slowly, to let grief and isolation erode him until there was nothing left. But life, it seemed, had other plans. Life kept insisting on continuing, on growing, on finding light even in the darkest corners. Boone closed the journal and walked to the window. Outside, the stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns, indifferent to human sorrow and human joy alike. The river sang its eternal song, and somewhere in the darkness, a mother mountain lion kept her vigil, waiting for something only she understood. "All right then," Boone whispered to the night. "I'm listening. Whatever comes next, I'm listening." The wilderness offered no answer, but deep in the forest, if a man listened carefully, he might hear the soft padding of great paws on pine needles and the steady breathing of something wild keeping watch over its own. August brought heat that shimmered off the rocks and turned the meadows golden brown. Scout had reached an awkward adolescent stage, all gangly limbs and oversized paws, her rosette spots beginning to fade into the solid, tawny coat of an adult mountain lion. She stood nearly 2 feet at the shoulder now, and though she still sought Boone's company, there was a restlessness in her that hadn't been there before. She would disappear for hours at a time, returning with dirt on her paws and pine needles in her fur, smelling of the deep forest. Boone tried not to think about what these absences meant. He'd started working on Sarah's garden plot again. It had taken him 3 days to work up the courage to clear the burned ground where her vegetables had once grown. But once he'd begun, the work had a meditative quality that settled something in his chest. He turned the soil, removed the charred remnants of the past, and prepared the earth for new growth. The lavender seeds Ruth had given him sat on his table in their cloth bag, waiting. But Boone wasn't ready for those yet. Instead, he'd ridden to Timber Falls and purchased seeds for practical things. Carrots, beans, squash. Plants that Sarah had grown, but not her favorites. Not yet. Small steps, as she'd always said. Scout watched him work in the garden with keen interest, occasionally attempting to help by digging enthusiastically in the freshly turned soil. Boone would shoo her away, and she would retreat to the shade of the porch, watching him with an expression that seemed almost thoughtful. It was during one of these garden sessions that Caleb Morrison arrived unannounced, his horse lathered and his face grim. Boone stood from his work, immediately recognizing that something was wrong. "Caleb, what is it?" "Got trouble," Caleb said, dismounting heavily. "Lost 6 head of cattle in the last week. Whatever's taking them is smart. Hits at night, takes the young or the weak, leaves barely any sign." Boone's stomach tightened. "You thinking what I'm thinking?" "Mountain lion," Caleb confirmed. "Big one, from the track Samuel found. And before you ask, no, it's not Scout. This cat's been working the range 10 miles south of here. But the ranchers are getting organized. They're talking about a hunt, bringing in men from Timber Falls with dogs and rifles. A hunt for one specific lion or any lion they come across?" Caleb's silence was answer enough. Boone looked over at Scout, who'd emerged from the porch and was investigating Caleb's horse with interest. She was large enough now that someone who didn't know her might mistake her for a threat. And once the hunters got started, once blood was up and fear was running high, distinctions like "this is a tame one" wouldn't matter much. "When?" Boone asked. 3 days, maybe 4. They're gathering men and dogs now." Caleb paused, his weathered face troubled. "Boone, I know what she means to you, but you need to think about what's coming. She's getting big enough that folks might not understand the difference between a lion that's been raised gentle and one that's wild." "She's not gentle," Boone said quietly. "She's what she is. I've just been keeping her safe while she grows strong enough to survive on her own." "And is she strong enough?" Boone watched Scout attempt to bat at the horse's tail, missing by several inches. She was growing, yes, but she was still young, still learning. Could she survive in the wild without the skills her mother would have taught her? Could she hunt well enough? Defend herself? Avoid the dangers that killed young mountain lions every season? He didn't know, and not knowing terrified him. "I'll figure something out," he said finally. Caleb laid a hand on his shoulder, the gesture brief but weighted with understanding. "Ruth said to tell you we'll help however we can. You know that, right? You're not alone in this." After Caleb left, Boone sat on his porch and tried to think through his options. He could keep Scout close to the cabin, limit her wandering, hope the hunters stayed south and never came this far north. But that was temporary at best, and it would mean confining her, limiting the freedom she craved. He could try to explain to the hunters that she was different, but men with bloodlust rarely stopped to ask questions. Or he could do what he'd known all along he would eventually have to do. He could let her go. That night, Boone took Scout to the tree line as usual. But instead of simply sitting with her, he stood and walked several paces into the forest. Scout followed immediately, her movements silent on the pine needle carpet, her whole body alert and interested. "Come on," Boone said softly. "Let's go a little further." They walked deeper into the woods than they'd ever gone together. Boone moved carefully, aware that this was Scout's domain, not his. The forest floor was thick with ferns and fallen logs, and the canopy overhead filtered the dying light into patterns that shifted and changed with every step. Scout ranged ahead of him, then circled back, her natural curiosity at war with her desire to stay close. After perhaps half a mile, Boone stopped in a small clearing where a fallen tree had created an opening in the canopy. The evening light fell through in golden shafts, and somewhere nearby he could hear running water. "This is your world," he told Scout, who sat beside him, panting lightly from the exertion. "This is where you're meant to be. Not in my cabin, not sleeping in a rocking chair. Here." Scout looked at him with those unsettling yellow eyes, and Boone could have sworn he saw understanding in them. But understanding and acceptance were two different things. She pressed against his leg, her purr audible in the quiet of the forest. They stayed there until full dark, and when Boone finally turned to head back to the cabin, Scout followed without hesitation. But something had shifted. Boone had crossed a threshold in his own thinking, had accepted what he'd been trying to avoid for weeks. The time was coming when he would have to let her go. Not because he wanted to, but because loving her meant wanting what was best for her, even if it broke his heart. Back at the cabin, Boone pulled out a piece of rawhide and began working on a project he'd been contemplating for days. He fashioned a simple pouch, waterproof and durable, just large enough to hold a few small items. Inside, he placed a lock of Scout's baby fur that he'd saved from her first grooming session, a small sketch he'd made of her sleeping in the rocking chair, and a note written in his careful hand. The note said simply, "Her name is Scout. She was loved." He tied the pouch securely and attached it to Scout's collar, tucked beneath the bell so it wouldn't interfere with her movement. If the worst happened, if she was found by someone who meant her harm, maybe, just maybe, this small proof of her story would make a difference, but he prayed it wouldn't come to that. That night, in the journal he wrote, "Caleb brought word of hunters coming for a lion that's been taking cattle. Scout's getting big enough that someone might mistake her for a threat. I'm running out of time to keep her safe. Started preparing for what I've been avoiding, the day when I'll have to say goodbye. The pouch is ready, the forest is waiting. Now I just need to find the courage to do what's right, instead of what I want." He looked over at Scout, who was stretched across the full length of Sarah's rocking chair now, her tail hanging over one arm, her head resting on the other. She was beautiful and wild and completely trusting, and the thought of her facing the world alone made Boone's chest ache. But the world was coming for her whether he was ready or not. And a man who truly loved something had to be willing to let it go, had to trust that the foundation he'd helped build was strong enough to carry it through whatever came next. Outside, the wilderness sang its night song, and somewhere in that darkness, a mother lion waited with a patience that seemed almost infinite, as if she'd known all along how this would end. The mother lion came for Scout on a Tuesday morning. 3 days before the hunters were set to arrive, Boone was splitting wood behind the cabin when he heard Scout's bell go silent. It wasn't the natural quiet of her settling down to rest. It was the sudden, complete cessation of sound that meant something had changed. He dropped his axe and moved quickly around to the front of the cabin, his heart already beginning to pound. Scout stood in the meadow about 30 yards from the porch, and facing her, massive and calm, was her mother. Boone froze. Every instinct screamed at him to call Scout back, to put himself between her and the mountain lion, but something held him still. This was the moment he'd known was coming since that first day at the river. This was the reckoning. The mother lion approached Scout slowly, her movements deliberate and unhurried. She was even larger than Boone remembered, easily 150 pounds of pure muscle and predatory grace. Scout stood her ground, her tail twitching, her body language uncertain. She looked back at Boone once, as if asking what she should do, and his heart broke at the question in her eyes. "It's all right," he called softly, his voice barely above a whisper. "She's your mother." "It's all right." The two lions touched noses, a gesture both tentative and profound. The mother circled Scout once, sniffing, investigating, taking the measure of what her cub had become. Scout submitted to the inspection with surprising patience, standing still as her mother nuzzled her neck, her flanks, relearning a scent that must have been familiar and foreign all at once. Then the mother lion looked directly at Boone. In all his years in the wilderness, Boone had never seen an animal look at him with such clear intelligence, such obvious purpose. The mother lion held his gaze for a long moment, and in that moment something passed between them. Not words, not thoughts exactly, but understanding. She was acknowledging what he'd done, the care he'd provided, the love he'd given to a creature that wasn't his to keep. And then she did something that changed everything. Instead of leading Scout away into the forest, the mother lion turned and began walking, not toward the tree line, but along the edge of the meadow, following the river upstream. After several paces she stopped and looked back, first at Scout, then at Boone. The meaning was unmistakable. "Follow me." Scout looked at Boone, confused and uncertain. she chirped, the sound plaintive, seeking guidance. Boone's mind raced. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. The mother was supposed to reclaim her cub and disappear into the wilderness. She wasn't supposed to invite a human to come along. Mountain lions didn't do that. It violated every natural law he understood. But then, this mountain lion had violated natural law from the very beginning. "All right," Boone said quietly, making his decision. He walked to the cabin, grabbed his rifle and canteen, and returned to where Scout waited. "Lead the way." The journey that followed was unlike anything Boone had ever experienced. The mother lion moved at a pace that was neither hurried nor leisurely, always staying far enough ahead that she didn't feel like a threat, but close enough that her direction was clear. Scout bounded between Boone and her mother, sometimes running ahead to investigate something interesting, sometimes dropping back to press against Boone's leg, as if reassuring herself he was still there. They followed the river upstream, moving deeper into country that Boone knew only slightly. The terrain grew rougher, the pines giving way to spruce and fir, the air growing thinner as they climbed. The mother lion led them around obstacles with the confidence of an animal that knew this land intimately, choosing paths that were challenging but never impossible for a man on foot. Hours passed. The sun climbed toward noon and began its descent toward the mountains. Boone's legs ached, and his boots had raised blisters, but he didn't stop. Whatever the mother lion was showing them, it was important enough that she'd abandoned all natural caution to do it. Finally, as the afternoon shadows were growing long, they came to a place where the river narrowed and rushed through a gorge. The mother lion stopped at the edge of a rocky outcrop and looked back at Boone. Then she disappeared over the edge. Scout followed without hesitation, and Boone, his heart in his throat, carefully made his way to the edge and looked down. A narrow game trail wound down the steep side of the gorge. It was treacherous, made more so by the spray from the rushing water below, but it was passable for someone who was careful. Boone started down, testing each foothold, his rifle slung across his back to keep his hands free. At the bottom of the gorge, the river had carved out a small cave behind a waterfall. The mother lion sat at the entrance, and Scout was already exploring the interior, her bell jingling faintly over the sound of falling water. Boone approached cautiously, giving the mother lion a wide berth. She watched him but didn't move, didn't show any sign of aggression. Her amber eyes were steady, patient, waiting for him to understand. He ducked into the cave, really more of an overhang than a true cave, but deep enough to provide shelter, and immediately saw what the mother lion had brought him to see: human remains. They were old, weathered by time and the elements, but unmistakably human. A skeleton lay against the back wall of the cave, partially covered by debris. Near the bones was a leather satchel, rotted but still intact enough to recognize. And beside the satchel, half buried in silt, was something that made Boone's breath stop in his chest: a woman's brooch. Silver and amethyst, worked in the shape of a flower. Boone's hands shook as he picked it up. He knew this brooch. He'd given it to Sarah on their first anniversary, had watched her pin it to her dress 100 times. It had been in their house when it burned. He'd assumed it was lost in the fire along with everything else, but it wasn't. It was here, in a cave behind a waterfall, miles from where Sarah had died. The world tilted. Boone sank to his knees, the brooch clutched in his fist, his mind struggling to make sense of what he was seeing. Sarah hadn't died in the fire. She'd survived. She'd gotten out somehow, had made it this far into the wilderness before. Before what? He looked at the skeleton more carefully, forcing his mind to work despite the shock. The bones showed no signs of violence, no obvious breaks or trauma. There was no evidence of predation, and the position of the body suggested that whoever this had been, they'd simply lain down and never gotten up again. Boone opened the rotted satchel with trembling hands. Inside, protected by the leather, were papers, letters, and a journal, not Sarah's flower journal, but a different one, smaller, with pages filled in her distinctive hand. He couldn't read it here, not in the failing light, not with his vision blurred by tears he couldn't hold back. But he didn't need to read it to understand the essential truth. Sarah had survived the fire. She'd been pregnant and injured and alone, and she'd made it this far into the wilderness before exhaustion or exposure or complications from her pregnancy had claimed her. She died here in this cave, with no one to hold her hand or whisper that everything would be all right, and somehow, impossibly, a mountain lion had found her body, had kept watch over it, had protected it from scavengers, and weather and time itself had waited 7 years for the day when she could lead someone to this place, lead him to this place. Boone looked up to find the mother lion standing at the cave entrance, silhouetted against the late afternoon light. She watched him with those wise, ancient eyes, and Boone finally understood the question that had haunted him since that first day at the river. Why had she left Scout with him? Why had she trusted a human with her most precious thing? Because she'd been keeping watch over Sarah, because she'd seen Boone's grief, his isolation, his desperate need for something to care for, because in some way that transcended species and language and logic. She'd understood that they could heal each other, Scout and Boone, each one broken in their own way, each one needing what the other could provide. The mother lion had given him her cub so that he would have a reason to keep living. And in return, she'd waited until he was ready to receive the gift she'd been guarding all these years, the truth about how Sarah had died, and the knowledge that her final resting place was beautiful and sacred and watched over by something wild and eternal. Boone wept then, truly wept for the first time since the fire. He wept for Sarah, who'd fought so hard to survive and had come so close. He wept for the child they'd never had. He wept for the 7 years he'd spent believing she'd burned, when in truth she'd died under open sky in a place of running, water and mountain stone. And he wept with something that wasn't quite grief and wasn't quite joy, a complicated emotion that encompassed loss and gratitude and the strange mercy of knowing the truth at last. Scout crept close and pressed against him, her small body warm and alive. The mother lion remained at the cave entrance, a guardian keeping watch as she'd done for 7 years. And outside, the waterfall sang its eternal song, the sound of water returning to water. Of all things, finding their way home eventually, in their own time, in their own fashion. Boone sat in that cave as the light failed, holding the brooch and the journal, surrounded by the bones of the woman he'd loved and the living warmth of a creature who'd been sent to save him. And for the first time in 7 years, he felt something like peace settle over his battered heart. Boone didn't return to his cabin that night. He couldn't leave Sarah, not after finding her, not after 7 years of believing she'd been lost to ash and flame. The mother lion disappeared into the darkness shortly after sunset, leaving Scout with Boone in the cave. He built a small fire near the entrance, careful to keep it away from Sarah's remains, and began reading her journal by firelight while Scout dozed against his side. The entries started the day of the fire. "The smoke woke me," Sarah had written in shaky script. "By the time I understood what was happening, the house was already burning. I tried to call for Boone, but the smoke was too thick. I found the window in our bedroom still intact and broke it with the water pitcher. The fall hurt. I think something's broken in my ankle, but I made it out." Boone's hands trembled as he turned the page. Outside, he'd been trying to reach her. Inside, she'd been escaping through a different route. If he'd known, if he'd looked, if he'd checked, but he hadn't, and she'd been too injured to make it back to town alone. "I can see Boone trying to get in through the front," the next entry read. "I want to call to him, but I can barely breathe. The smoke did something to my lungs. I tried to go to him, but my ankle won't hold my weight. I dragged myself into the trees before anyone saw me. I don't know why I hid. Shock, maybe. Or the baby. I kept thinking about the baby, about keeping her safe." Her, Boone thought. Sarah had been certain they were having a daughter. The entries continued, documenting Sarah's agonizing journey into the wilderness. She'd been too ashamed to go back, convinced that Boone would blame her for the fire, that the town would judge her for surviving when everything else burned. Her reasoning made no sense, but Boone understood trauma's twisted logic. She'd been injured, pregnant, terrified, and not thinking clearly. She'd followed the river, using it as both compass and water source. She'd survived on berries and roots, had somehow managed to keep moving despite her damaged ankle and weakening body. The journal entries grew shorter, more fragmented, as exhaustion took its toll. Found a cave behind a waterfall, one entry read. Safe here. Will rest and then try to find my way to the Morrison ranch. They'll help. They won't judge, but she'd never made it to the Morrisons. The next several entries were dated days apart, each one revealing how her condition was deteriorating. She was ill, feverish, struggling with complications from the pregnancy. And through it all, one constant theme emerged: her love for Boone, her regret at not calling out to him, her hope that somehow he'd find her. There's a mountain lion that comes to the cave, she wrote toward the end. She should frighten me, but she doesn't. She brings me rabbits, leaves them at the cave entrance. I think she's pregnant too. We're two mothers-to-be in the wilderness, trying to survive. Strange to find companionship in a wild creature, but I'm grateful for it. Boone's breath caught. The mother lion had been caring for Sarah, bringing her food, keeping watch over her. The final entry was dated 3 weeks after the fire. I think my time is coming. The baby, I mean. I'm not strong enough for this. My body knows it even if my heart won't accept it. If anyone finds this journal, please tell Boone I loved him. Tell him it wasn't his fault. Tell him the fire was an accident. I'd left the stove going to warm water for tea and fallen asleep. Tell him I'm sorry I didn't call out. Tell him I was afraid and foolish and I wish I'd been braver. Tell him our daughter would have been beautiful. The journal ended there. Boone sat in the firelight, tears streaming down his face, the truth finally complete. Sarah had died giving birth to their daughter, alone in a cave, watched over by a mountain lion. She'd faced her final moments with the courage he'd always known she possessed. And the lion, the mother lion who'd brought Scout to him, had witnessed it all. Had the lion been giving birth at the same time? Had Scout and Sarah's daughter been born within hours or days of each other in this wild place? The question didn't matter, not really. What mattered was understanding the grief the mother lion must have carried. She'd tried to help Sarah, had brought her food, had kept her safe. But wild creatures couldn't save humans from human ailments. She'd watched Sarah die, had perhaps understood in some instinctual way what it meant to lose another mother. And when Scout was drowning in the river, when this same lion could have simply let nature take its course, she'd remembered. She'd remembered the human who'd shared her cave, who'd needed help she couldn't provide. She'd remembered her own grief at failing to save someone she'd tried to protect, so she'd given her cub to the man who'd loved that human. She'd trusted him with her most precious thing because she understood loss, understood grief, understood the need for second chances, even when the world seemed determined to deny them. Boone looked at Scout, sleeping peacefully by the fire, her spotted coat rising and falling with each breath. She was the mother lion's gift and burden, given to heal them both, Boone's grief and the lion's guilt over failing to save Sarah. When dawn broke, Boone knew what he had to do. He couldn't leave Sarah here. This cave was beautiful, and the mother lion had protected her faithfully, but Sarah deserved to rest in ground he could tend, in a place he could visit without a day's journey through wilderness. She deserved a marker, a memorial, some acknowledgement of the life she'd lived and the courage she'd shown. But more than that, she deserved the garden she'd planned, the lavender seeds Ruth had given him, a place where beauty could grow from sorrow. He spent the morning carefully gathering Sarah's remains, wrapping them in his coat with the gentleness she deserved. The brooch he tucked in his shirt pocket close to his heart. The journals, both hers and the one she'd been writing in, he placed carefully in the rotted satchel, determined to preserve her words. The journey back to the cabin took most of the day. Scout sensed his sorrow and stayed close, rarely wandering more than a few feet from his side. The mother lion appeared periodically, always at a distance, always watching. She knew what he carried, Boone realized. She was bearing witness, seeing Sarah's final journey home. When he reached his cabin, the sun was setting in the same way it had set the evening he'd first brought Scout across this threshold. But everything was different now. He wasn't returning to isolation and grief. He was returning with truth and understanding and the complicated gift of closure. He buried Sarah in the garden plot she'd loved, in ground he'd recently prepared for new growth. It felt right, planting her where she could nurture the flowers and vegetables she'd adored in life. He worked through the night by lantern light, digging deep and careful, making sure everything was done properly. As he worked, the mother lion sat at the edge of the tree line, watching. Scout sat beside him, patient and quiet, as if she understood the solemnity of what was happening. When Sarah was finally laid to rest, Boone sat back and let exhaustion wash over him. He'd been awake for nearly 40 hours, had walked more miles than he could count, had discovered and buried the woman he loved. His body ached, and his heart felt scraped raw. But there was something else too, something underneath the grief and exhaustion, something that felt almost like relief. He knew now. After 7 years of terrible imaginings, after countless nights replaying the fire in his mind and wondering if she'd suffered, he knew. Sarah had survived the fire. She'd fought to live. She hadn't died in flames, but under open sky. And in her final moments, she'd been watched over by a creature that understood maternal love and loss. "Thank you," Boone said quietly to the mother lion, "for taking care of her, for bringing Scout to me, for waiting all this time to show me the truth." The mountain lion regarded him with her amber eyes, and Boone could have sworn he saw acknowledgement there. Then she rose and padded silently into the forest, leaving Scout sitting in the grass beside Sarah's grave. Boone looked at the young mountain lion, remembering the day he'd pulled her from the river, the weeks of feeding and caring and worrying. She'd grown so much, had become strong and capable, and ready for the life that awaited her. "You know she's going to call for you soon," he told Scout. "Your mama. She's going to want you back now that this is finished." Scout tilted her head, her yellow eyes reflecting the lantern light. "And you should go," Boone continued, his voice rough with emotion. "This was always temporary. You belong out there, not in here with me. Your mother gave you to me for a season, and that season's ending." Scout moved closer and pressed her head against his hand. Boone scratched behind her ears the way she liked, memorizing the feel of her fur, the rumble of her purr, the weight of her presence. Tomorrow he would plant the lavender seeds over Sarah's grave. Tomorrow he would begin the work of grief that he'd been avoiding for 7 years. Tomorrow he would let Scout go back to her mother and the wild life she was meant for. But tonight they would sit together one last time, a man and a mountain lion, bound by circumstance and love and the strange mercy of second chances. Tonight they would keep vigil over the woman who'd brought them together, even in death. And in the morning, when the mother lion's call echoed through the trees, Boone would be ready to say goodbye. The mother lion's call came at dawn, just as Boone had known it would. It wasn't a scream or a roar, nothing aggressive or urgent. It was a low, resonant sound that seemed to roll down from the mountains themselves, a summons that was both gentle and absolute. Scout, who'd been sleeping against Boone's leg on the porch, lifted her head immediately, her ears swiveling toward the sound. Boone felt his throat tighten. "That's her calling you home." Scout looked at him, those yellow eyes searching his face as if trying to understand words she couldn't speak. She chirped, the small, questioning sound she'd made since she was tiny, and Boone had to swallow hard before he could respond. "I know," he said quietly. "I know it's hard. But she's your mother, Scout. She's been waiting for you all this time, keeping watch, making sure you grew strong. And you did. You grew strong and smart and ready." The call came again, closer this time. The mother lion was at the edge of the tree line. Boone could feel it even without seeing her. Scout rose to her feet, her body tense with conflicting instincts. She took 3 steps toward the trees, then stopped and looked back at Boone. He stood slowly, his joints protesting after the long night, and walked to where Scout waited. He knelt beside her, running his hands one last time through her fur, feeling the solid muscle beneath, the strength she'd developed over these months. "I need you to listen to me," he said, his voice steady despite the ache in his chest. "Your mother did something extraordinary when she left you with me. She trusted me with her most precious thing because she understood grief and loss and the need for healing. She gave us both a gift. You gave me a reason to keep living. And I gave you a safe place to grow strong. Scout pressed her head against his chest, a purring. But gifts aren't meant to be kept forever, Boone continued. They're meant to be appreciated and then released. You're wild, Scout, you always were. And the wild is calling you back. Your mother's calling you back. And as much as it hurts, and God knows it hurts, I have to let you go. He reached for her collar, the soft leather that had carried his father's bell for these months. His fingers fumbled with the buckle, suddenly clumsy with emotion. When it came free, the weight of it in his hand felt like the weight of all his grief, for Sarah, for Scout, for all the things he'd loved and lost. But underneath the grief was something else, something that felt almost like gratitude. The pouch is still there, he said, showing Scout the small leather bundle he'd attached to the collar. Has your baby fur in it, and a drawing I made, and a note that says you were loved. I'm keeping it to remember. But you don't need it. You've got everything you need right here. He tapped her chest gently. Over her heart, Scout nuzzled his hand, and Boone pulled her close one last time, breathing in the scent of her, pine and earth and wild places. Be careful out there, he whispered. Hunt well. Stay away from humans who don't understand what you are, and if you ever need anything, if you're ever in trouble, you come back here. This will always be a safe place for you. The mother lion called again, a sound both patient and insistent. Boone released Scout and stood. Go on now. She's waiting. Scout took several steps toward the trees, then stopped again, looking back. The indecision in her stance broke Boone's heart. She was torn between two worlds, two loves, two kinds of belonging. It's all right, Boone said, his voice breaking slightly. It's all right to go. I'll be all right. I promise. It was the promise that did it. Scout seemed to understand, in whatever way a wild creature understands such things, that Boone was giving her permission to leave, was telling her that his survival didn't depend on her presence. She chirped one last time, a sound Boone would hear in his dreams for the rest of his life, then turned and bounded toward the trees. The mother lion emerged from the shadows to meet her, and for a moment the two mountain lions stood together, touching noses in that same tentative greeting they'd shared days before. But this time Scout didn't look back at Boone. This time, when the mother turned to lead her daughter into the forest, Scout followed without hesitation. Boone watched them disappear into the pines, the morning light filtering through the branches in shafts of gold. He stood there long after they were gone, listening to the wilderness settle back into its rhythms, feeling the absence of Scout's weight against his leg like a physical ache. But he didn't call her back. And slowly, as the sun climbed higher and the day warmed around him, Boone felt something shift in his chest, a loosening of a different kind than he'd felt before. This wasn't the breaking open of old wounds. This was the final release of something he'd been holding too tightly for too long. He looked down at Scout's collar in his hands, the bell catching the morning light. Then he walked to Sarah's grave and knelt beside the freshly turned earth. I found you, Boone said to the grave. After all this time, I found you. And I understand now why you didn't call out to me that day. I understand the fear and the shame and the confusion. I would have understood then too, if you'd given me the chance. But we don't get to redo those moments, do we? We only get to move forward with what we learn from them. He set Scout's collar gently on the grave, arranging it so the bell rested on top of the turned earth. The morning breeze moved through it, creating the faintest chime, a sound that had become as familiar to him as his own heartbeat over these months. A mountain lion brought me your truth, he continued, his voice steady now. She watched over you when I couldn't. She tried to help you when you needed it. And then, when her own cub was in danger, she remembered you. She remembered what it meant to try to save someone and fail. So she gave me her daughter, gave me a chance to succeed where she'd failed. Boone pulled the bag of lavender seeds from his pocket, the cloth soft from Ruth Morrison's careful handling. He'd been carrying them for weeks, unable to bring himself to plant them. But now, kneeling beside Sarah's grave with Scout's bell chiming softly in the breeze, he knew the time had come. You always said small steps were how you covered great distances, he said, opening the bag. I've been taking those steps, Sarah. Slower than you'd probably like, but I'm walking. Scout taught me that it's possible to love something and let it go. Taught me that grief and joy can exist in the same heart. Taught me that healing doesn't mean forgetting. He began working the seeds into the soil with his fingers, spacing them carefully the way Sarah had always done in her garden. These will bloom next spring, he told her. Lavender like you loved. And I'll plant more, all your favorites. I'll make this garden beautiful again, the way you wanted it. Not to replace what was lost, but to honor what we had. The work was meditative, purposeful. Each seed placed with intention, with memory, with love. Boone found himself talking to Sarah as he worked, telling her about Scout, about the cave behind the waterfall, about the 7 years he'd spent believing she'd burned, when in truth she'd died under the wide Montana sky. "I'm sorry I didn't find you sooner," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm sorry you were alone at the end, but I'm grateful. God help me, I'm grateful that you had the lion with you, that you weren't completely alone, that something wild and beautiful kept watch over you." When all the seeds were planted, Boone sat back on his heels and looked at his work. The grave was simple but dignified, marked now by Scout's collar and the promise of lavender to come. It wasn't the elaborate memorial Sarah deserved, but it was honest. It was real. It was a beginning. The sound of hoofbeats brought his head up. Caleb Morrison was riding into the clearing, and behind him came Thomas, leading a small wagon. Ruth sat on the wagon seat, and in the back Boone could see lumber and tools. They'd come to help. Somehow they'd known, or perhaps Ruth's intuition had simply told her that today was the day Boone would need them. Caleb dismounted and stood at the edge of the garden plot, taking in the freshly turned earth and the collar with the bell. His weathered face was grave but understanding. "Thomas mentioned you'd been asking after cedar wood last week," Caleb said quietly. "Figured you might be needing a marker built." Ruth climbed down from the wagon and came to stand beside Boone. She didn't ask questions, didn't demand explanations. She simply laid a hand on his shoulder and said, "We're here to help. Boone, whatever you need." Boone looked at these people who'd refused to let him disappear completely into his grief, who'd brought milk for an orphaned cub and seeds for a dead woman's garden, who'd ridden out at dawn to help build a memorial for someone they'd loved. "Thank you," he managed, the words inadequate but sincere. Together, they spent the day building a headstone from cedar, strong and fragrant and resistant to the elements. Samuel, who had skill with letters, carved Sarah's name and the dates of her birth and death. Beneath that, at Boone's request, he added a single line: "She loved beauty and was loved in return." As the sun began its descent toward the mountains, they stood together around Sarah's grave, Boone, the Morrison family, and the memory of a woman who died alone, but was now properly mourned. Ruth said a prayer, her voice strong and clear in the mountain air. And when she finished, Boone added words of his own. "Rest well, Sarah. You're home now. And I'll be all right. Scout taught me that. The lion who watched over you sent her daughter to watch over me. And between the two of them, they've shown me that it's possible to survive grief. More than survive, to live again." The bell on Scout's collar chimed softly as the evening breeze picked up. And somewhere in the distance a mountain lion screamed, not in anger or fear, but in simple acknowledgement of her territory, her life, her place in the wild order of things. Boone closed his eyes and listened, and for the first time in 7 years, the sound didn't fill him with dread or longing. It filled him with something closer to peace. The hunters came through 3 days later, just as Caleb had warned. Boone heard them before he saw them. The baying of hounds, the rough voices of men pushing through the underbrush. He'd been working in Sarah's garden, transplanting wildflowers he'd gathered from the meadows, when the sounds reached him. His first instinct was fear for Scout, but he pushed it down. She was with her mother now, deep in territory these men would never reach. She was safe. Still, he positioned himself at the edge of his property, rifle loose in his hands, ready to redirect the hunters if they came too close. The lead hunter was a man named Garrett from Timber Falls, known for his skill tracking predators. He pulled up short when he saw Boone, raising a hand to halt the men behind him. "Laramie," Garrett said, surprised. "Didn't expect to find you out here." "It's my land," Boone replied evenly. "What brings you through?" "Tracking the lion that's been taking cattle. Trail led north, but we lost it in the rocks near Willow Creek. Thought we'd swing through this area before heading back." Boone kept his expression neutral. "Haven't seen any sign of lion trouble up this way." "The one taking cattle is working further south, from what I hear." Garrett studied him for a long moment. The hounds were restless, pulling at their leads, but their excitement seemed more general than specific. "They hadn't picked up Scout's scent then." "Good. You're probably right," Garrett said finally. "We'll head back south, work that area more thoroughly." He paused, then added, "Heard a strange rumor in town. Heard you'd been raising a mountain lion cub." "Rumors tend to grow in the telling," Boone said carefully, "so it's not true." Boone chose his words with care. "I pulled a drowning cub from the river some months back. Kept her alive until she was strong enough to survive on her own. Then her mother came and took her back to the wild where she belongs. That's the truth of it." One of the other hunters spat tobacco juice and shook his head. "That's the damnedest thing I ever heard. A she-lion just left her cub with you." "Nature works in ways we don't always understand," Boone said. "But the cub's back with her mother now. Been gone near a week. So if you're looking for a mountain lion causing trouble, you won't find it here." Garrett nodded slowly. "Fair enough. We'll be moving on then. You take care, Laramie." Boone watched them ride away, the hounds' voices fading into the distance. Only when he was certain they were gone did he allow himself to relax. Scout was safe. The wilderness was vast, and the hunters would never find the territory where she and her mother ranged. The days that followed settled into a new rhythm. Boone tended Sarah's grave and the garden growing around it, watching as small green shoots began to emerge from the soil. He rode to the Morrison Ranch once a week, sharing meals and conversation, slowly rebuilding the connections to human community that he'd severed 7 years ago. He wrote in Sarah's journal regularly now, documenting not just the facts of his days, but his feelings, his memories, his slow journey back towards something resembling peace. The pages filled with observations about the changing seasons, about the garden's progress, about the way grief softened at the edges when you finally allowed yourself to feel it fully. One evening in late September, as the aspens were beginning to turn gold and the air held the first hint of coming winter, Boone sat on his porch and heard a familiar sound. The jingle of a brass bell. His heart leaped. He stood slowly, hardly daring to believe, and there at the edge of the clearing stood Scout. She'd grown even larger in the weeks since he'd last seen her. Her spots almost completely faded now, her body sleek and powerful. She was fully wild, fully herself, a mountain lion in every sense of the word. But when she saw him, she chirped, that same questioning sound from her kittenhood, and bounded across the meadow toward him. Boone met her halfway, dropping to his knees as she crashed into him with enough force to knock him backward. She was purring that deep, rumbling sound, and rubbing her head against his chest the way she used to. Around her neck was the collar he'd removed, the bell chiming with her movements. "How did you—" Boone started, then stopped. The mother lion stood at the tree line, watching. She'd brought Scout back, had somehow found the collar, and returned it to her daughter. It was a gift, Boone realized, a way of saying that Scout could belong to both worlds, wild and tame, forest and hearth, mother and friend. He spent an hour with Scout, stroking her fur and telling her about the garden, about Sarah's grave, about the life he was building. She listened with that intense focus she'd always had, as if she understood every word. And when she finally rose to leave, Boone didn't try to stop her. "Come back whenever you want," he told her. "You'll always be welcome here," she chirped once more, then turned and loped back to where her mother waited. Together they disappeared into the forest, the sound of the bell fading gradually until it was swallowed by the wilderness. Boone returned to his porch and sat in the gathering darkness, listening to the river's eternal song. Sarah was at rest in ground he could tend. Scout was thriving in the wild where she belonged. And he was learning to live again, one small step at a time. The brass bell would ring again. He was certain of it. Scout would return periodically, a bridge between his solitary life and the wild world beyond. And each time she came, she would bring with her the reminder that love didn't have to be possession, that grief could coexist with joy, that healing was possible even when you'd given up hope. In the distance, a mountain lion screamed, the sound carrying clearly through the mountain air. Boone smiled and raised his coffee cup in silent toast to Sarah, to Scout, to the mother lion who'd orchestrated this strange and beautiful mercy, to second chances and small steps in the sacred mystery of connection across all the boundaries that should have kept them apart, to life continuing despite everything, in ways both wild and wonderful. The stars emerged one by one overhead, ancient and patient. The river sang on toward its distant destination, and in his cabin by the water's edge, a man who'd been drowning in grief finally found solid ground beneath his feet, steadied by the memory of a woman he'd loved and the gift of a mountain lion who'd saved them both.